Now we will cover sixth chapter, a new chapter of class 8 NCERT history section, our past, part 2. This is another book, chapter 6, weavers, iron smelters and factory owners. Weavers, iron smelters and factory owners. So this chapter tells the story of the crafts and industries of India during British rule by focusing on two industries, namely textiles and iron and steel. Both these industries were crucial for the industrial revolution in the modern world. Mechanized production of cotton textiles made Britain the foremost industrial nation in the 19th century. And when its iron and steel industries started growing from the 1850s, Britain came to be known as the workshop of the world. The industrialization of Britain had a close connection with the conquest and colonization of India. We have seen earlier that how the English East India Company's interest in trade led to occupation of territory and how the pattern of trade changed over the decades. In the late 18th century, the company was buying goods in India. In the late 18th century, the company was buying goods in India and exporting them to England and Europe, making profit through the sale. With the growth of industrial production, British industrialists began to see India as a vast market for their industrial products, and over time, manufactured goods from Britain began flooding India. How did this affect Indian crafts and industries? This we will explore further in this chapter. Indian textiles and the world market. Let us first look at textile production. Around 1750, before the British conquered Bengal, India was by far the world's largest producer of cotton textiles. Indian textile had long been renowned both for their fine quality and exquisite craftsmanship. They were extensively traded in Southeast Asia, Java, Sumatra, and Penang, and West and Central Asia. From the 16th century, European trading companies began buying Indian textiles for sale in Europe. Memories of this flourishing trade and the craftsmanship of Indian weavers is preserved in many words still current in English and other languages. It is interesting to trace the origin of such words and see what they tell us. Words tell us histories. European traders first encountered fine cotton cloth from India carried by Arab merchants in Mosul in present day Iraq. So they began referring to all finely woven textiles as muslin, a word that acquired wide currency when the Portuguese first came to India in search of spices. They landed in Calicut on the Kerala coast in southwest India. The cotton textiles which they took back to Europe derived from Calicut, and subsequently calico became the general name for all cotton textiles. There are many other words which point to the popularity of Indian textiles in Western markets. East English East India Company sent to its representatives in Calcutta in 1730. An page of an order book. The order that year was for 5,89,000 pieces of cloth. Browsing through the order book, we would have seen a list of 98 varieties of cotton and silk cloths. These were known by their common name in the European trade as piece goods, usually woven cloth pieces that were 20 yards long and 1 yard wide. Amongst the pieces ordered in bulk were printed cotton cloths called chintz, Ch-6 or khassa, and bandana. Do you all know that where the English term chintz come from? It is derived from the Hindi word chint, a cloth with small and colorful flowery designs. From the 1680s, there started a craze for printed Indian cotton textiles in England and Europe, mainly for their exquisite floral designs, fine texture, and relative cheapness. Rich people of England, including the Queen herself, wore clothes of Indian fabric. Similarly, the word bandana now refers to any brightly colored and printed scarf for the neck or head. Originally, the term derived from the word bandhana, Hindi for tying, and referred to a variety of brightly colored cloth produced through a method of tying and dyeing. There were other cloths in the order book that were noted by the place of origin. Kasim Bazar, Patna, Calcutta, Orissa, Charpuri. The widespread use of such words shows how popular Indian textiles had become in different parts of the world. Indian textiles in European markets. By the early 18th century, worried by the popularity of Indian textiles, wool and silk makers in England began protesting against the import of Indian cotton textiles. In 1720, the British government enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textiles chintz in England. Interestingly, this act was known as the Calico Act. At this time, textile industries had just begun to develop in England. Unable to compete with Indian textiles, English producers wanted a secure market within the country by preventing the entry of Indian textiles. The first to grow under government protection was the calico printing industry. Indian designs were now imitated and printed in England on white muslin or plain unbleached Indian cloth. Competition with Indian textiles also led to a search for technological innovation in England. In 1764, the spinning jenny was invented by John Kay, which increased the productivity of the traditional spindles. Spinning jenny is a machine by which a single worker could operate several spindles onto which thread was spun. When the wheel was turned, all the spindles rotated. The invention of the steam engine by Richard Arkwright in 1786 revolutionized cotton textile weaving. Cloth could now be woven in immense quantities and cheaply too. However, Indian textiles continued to dominate world trade till the end of the 18th century. European trading companies, the Dutch, the French, and the English, made enormous profits out of this flourishing trade. These companies purchased cotton and silk textiles in India by importing silver, but as we know that when the English East India Company gained political power in Bengal, it no longer had to import precious metal to buy Indian goods. Instead, they collected revenues from peasants and zamindars in India and used this revenue to buy Indian textiles. Who were the weavers? Weavers often belonged to communities that specialized in weaving. Their skills were passed on from one generation to the next. The Tanti weavers of Bengal, the Julahas or Momin weavers of North India, Sale and Kaikolar and Devangs of South India are some of the communities famous for weaving. The first stage of production was spinning, a work done mostly by women. The charkha and the takli were household spinning instruments. The thread was spun on the charkha and rolled on the takli. When the spinning was over, the thread was woven into cloth by the weaver. In most communities, weaving was a task done by men. For colored textiles, the thread was dyed by the dyer known as rangares. For printed cloth, the weavers needed the help of specialist block printers known as chippigers. Handloom weaving and the occupations associated with it provided livelihood for millions of Indians. The decline of Indian textiles. The development of cotton industries in Britain affected textile producers in India in several ways. First, Indian textiles now had to compete with British textiles in the European and American markets. Second, exporting textiles to England also became increasingly difficult since very high duties were imposed on Indian textiles imported into Britain. By the beginning of the 19th century, English made cotton textiles successfully ousted Indian goods from their traditional markets in Africa, America, and Europe. Thousands of weavers in India were now thrown out of employment. Bengal weavers were the worst hit. English and European companies stopped buying Indian goods, and their agents no longer gave out advances to weavers to secure supplies. Distressed weavers wrote petitions to the government to help them, but worse was still to come. By the 1830s, British cotton cloth flooded Indian markets. In fact, by the 1880s, two-thirds of all the cotton clothes worn by Indians were made of cotton produced in Britain. This affected not only specialist weavers but also spinners. Thousands of rural women Thousands of rural women who made a living by spinning cotton thread were rendered jobless. Handloom weaving did not completely die in India. This was because some types of cloths could not be supplied by machines. How could machines produce saris with intricate borders or cloths with traditional woven patterns? These had a wide demand not only amongst the rich but also amongst the middle classes. Nor did the textile manufacturers in Britain produce the very coarse cloths used by the poor people in India. You must have heard of Solapur in western India and Madura in South India. These towns emerged as important new centers of weaving in the late 19th century. Later, during the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi urged people to boycott imported textiles and use hand spun and hand woven cloth. Khadi gradually became a symbol of nationalism. The charkha came to represent India, and it was put at the center of the tricolor flag of the Indian National Congress, adopted in 1931. What happened to the weavers and spinners who lost their livelihood? Many weavers became agricultural laborers. Some migrated to cities in search of work, and yet others went out of the country to work in plantations in Africa and South America. Some of these handloom weavers also found work in the new cotton mills that were established in Bombay from Mumbai, now Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Solapur, Nagpur, and Kanpur. Cotton mills come up. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in 1854. From the early 19th century, Bombay had grown as an important port for the export of raw cotton from India to England and China. It was close to the vast black soil tract of western India where cotton was grown. When the cotton textile mills came up, they could get supplies of raw material with ease. By 1900, over 84 mills started operating in Bombay. Many of these were established by Parsi and Gujarati businessmen who had made their money through trade with China. Mills came up in other cities too. The first mill in Ahmedabad was started in 1861. A year later, a mill was established in Kanpur in the United Provinces. Growth of cotton mills led to a demand for labor. Thousands of poor peasants, artisans, and agricultural laborers moved to the cities to work in the mills. In the first few decades of its existence, the textile factory industry in India faced many problems. It found it difficult to compete with the cheap textiles imported from Britain. In most countries, governments supported industrialization by imposing heavy duties on imports. This eliminated competition and protected infant industries. The colonial government in India usually refused such protection to local industries. The first major spurt in the development of cotton factory production in India, therefore, was during the First World War, when textile imports from Britain declined and Indian factories were called upon to produce cloth for military supplies. We must starve for food. In 1823, the company government in India received a petition from 12,000 weavers stating, "Our ancestors and we used to receive advances from the company and maintain ourselves and our respective families by weaving company's superior assortments. Owing to our misfortune, the orangs have been abolished over since, because of which we and our families are distressed for want of the means of livelihood. We are weavers and do not know any other business. We must starve for food if the Board of Trade do not cast a look of kindness towards us and give orders for clothes." Orangs are a Persian term for a warehouse, a place where goods are collected before being sold. Also refers to a workshop. Please publish this in your paper. So one, this is source 2 of this chapter. One widowed spinner wrote in 1828 to a Bengali newspaper, Samachar Darpan, detailing her plight. To the editor, Samachar, "I am a spinner. After having suffered a great deal, I am writing this letter. Please publish this in your paper. When my age was 22, I became a widow with three daughters. My husband left nothing at the time of his death. I sold my jewelry for his Shraddh ceremony. When we were on the verge of starvation, God showed me a way by which we could save ourselves. I began to spin on takli and charkha. The weavers used to visit our houses and buy the charkha yarn at 3 tolas per rupee, whatever amount I wanted as advance from the weavers. I could get for the asking. This saved us from cares about food and cloth. In a few years, in a few years' time, I got together rupees 28 with this. I married one daughter, and in the same way, all three daughters. Now, for 3 years, we two women, mother-in-law, and me are in want of food. The weavers do not call at the house for buying yarn. Not only this, if the yarn is sent to market, it is still not sold even at one fourth the old prices. I do not know how it happened. I asked many about it. They say that Bilati to yarn is being imported on a large scale. The weavers buy that yarn and weave. People cannot use the cloth out of this yarn even for 2 months. It rots away. The sword of Tipu Sultan and wood steel. So, we begin the story of Indian steel and iron metallurgy by recounting the famous story of Tipu Sultan, who ruled Mysore till 1799, fought 4 wars with the British, and died fighting with his sword in his hand. Tipu's legendary swords are now part of valuable collections in museums in England. But do you know why the sword was so special? The sword had an incredibly hard and sharp edge that could easily rip through the opponent's armor. This quality of the sword came from a special type of high carbon steel called woods, which was produced all over South India. Woods steel, when made into swords, produced a very sharp edge with a flowing water pattern. This pattern came from very small carbon crystals embedded in the iron. Francis Buchanan, who taught through Mysore in 1800, a year after Tipu Sultan's death, has left us an account of the technique by which wood steel was produced in many hundreds of smelting furnaces in Mysore. In these furnaces, iron was mixed with charcoal and put inside small clay pots. Through an intricate control of temperatures, the smelters produced steel ingots that were used for sword making not just in India but in West and Central Asia too. Woods is an anglicized version of the Kannada word ukku, Telugu hukku, and Tamil and Malayalam urukku, meaning steel. Indian woods steel fascinated European scientist Michel Faraday and legendary scientist and discoverer of electricity and electromagnetism spent 4 years studying the properties of Indian woods. 1818 to 22. However, the wood steel making process, which was so widely known in South India, was completely lost by the mid 19th century. The swords and armor making industry died with the conquest of India by the British, and imports of iron and steel from England displaced the iron and steel produced by craftspeople in India. Abandoned furnaces in villages. Production of wood steel required a highly specialized technique of refining iron, but iron smelting in India was extremely common till the end of the 19th century. Bihar and central India, in particular, every district had smelters that used local deposits of ore to produce iron, which was widely used for the manufacture of implements and tools of daily use. The furnaces were most often built of clay and sun dried bricks. The smelting was done by men, while women worked the bellows, pumping air that kept the charcoal burning. Bellows are a device or equipment that can pump air. A device or equipment that can pump air is known as bellows. So by the late 19th century, however, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. In most villages, furnaces fell into disuse and the amount of iron produced came down. Why was this so? One reason was the new forest laws that we have discussed earlier in chapter 4, when the colonial government prevented people from entering the reserved forests. How could the iron smelters find wood for charcoal? Where could they get iron ore? Defying forest laws, they often entered the forests secretly and collected wood, but they could not on sustain their occupation on this basis for long. Many gave up their craft and looked for other means of livelihood. In some areas, the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they used. This reduced their income. Moreover, by the late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. Ironsmiths in India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. This inevitably lowered the demand for iron produced by local smelters. By the early 20th century, the artisans producing iron and steel faced a new competition. Source 3, a widespread industry. According to a report of the Geological Survey of India, iron smelting was at one time a widespread industry in India, and there is hardly a district away from the great alluvial tracts of the Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra in which slag heaps are not found, for the primitive iron smelter finds no difficulty in obtaining sufficient supplies of ore from deposits that no European iron master would regard as worth his serious consideration. Iron and steel. So, slag heaps, first of all, slag heaps, the waste left when smelting metal. The waste left when smelting metal is known as slag heaps. Iron and steel factories come up in India. The year was 1904. In the hot month of April, Charles Weld, an American geologist, and Dorabji Tata, the eldest son of Jamsetji Tata, were traveling in Chhattisgarh in search of iron ore deposits. They had spent many months on a costly venture looking for sources of good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Jamsetji Tata had decided to spend a large part of his fortune to build a big iron and steel industry in India, but this could not be done without identifying the source of fine quality iron ore. One day, after traveling for many hours in the forest, Weld and Dorabji came upon a small village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. These people were the Agarias. When asked where they had found the iron ore, the Agarias pointed to a hill in the distance. Weld and Torabji reached the hill after an exhausting trek through dense forest. On exploring the hill, the geologists declared that they had at last found that what they had been looking for. Rajhara Hills had one of the finest ores in the world, but there was a problem. The region was dry and water necessary for running the factory was not to be found nearby. The Tatas had to continue their search for a more suitable place to set up their factory. However, the Agarias helped in the discovery of a source of iron ore that would later supply the Bhilai steel plant. A few years later, a large area of forest was cleared on the banks of the river Subarnarekha to set up the factory and an industrial township, Jamshedpur. Here there was water near iron ore deposits. The Tata Iron and Steel Company that came up began producing steel in 1912. Tisco was set up at an opportune time. All through the late 19th century, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Expansion of the railways in India had provided a huge market for rails that Britain produced. For a long while, British experts in the Indian railways were unwilling to believe that good quality steel could be produced in India. By the time Tisco was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of war in Europe. So, imports of British steel into India declined dramatically, and the Indian Railways turned to Tisco for supply of rails. As the war dragged on for several years, Tisco had to produce shells and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by Tisco. Over time, Tisco became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. In the case of iron and steel, as in the case of cotton textiles, industrial expansion occurred only when British imports into India declined and the market for Indian industrial goods increased. This happened during the First World War and after. As the nationalist movement developed and the industrial class became stronger, the demand for government protection became louder. Struggling to retain its control over India, the British government had to concede many of these demands in the last decades of colonial rule. Early years of industrialization in Japan. The history of industrialization of Japan in the late 19th century presents a contrast to that of India. The colonial state in India, keen to expand the market for British goods, was willing to support Indian industrialists. In Japan, the state encouraged the growth of industries. The Meiji regime, which assumed power in Japan in 1868, believed that Japan needed to industrialize in order to resist Western domination. So it initiated a series of measures to help industrialization. Postal services, telegraph, railways, steam powered shipping were developed. The most advanced technology from the West was imported and adapted to the needs of Japan. Foreign experts train were brought to train Japanese professionals. Industrialists were provided with generous loans for investments by banks set up the government. Large industries were first started by the government and then sold off at cheap rates to business families. In India, colonial domination created barriers to industrialization. In Japan, the fear of foreign conquest spurred industrialization, but this also meant that the Japanese industrial development from the beginning was linked to military needs. So, this is all about chapter 6, weavers, iron smelters, and factory owners.